I'm ready. Okay, so welcome tonight, the last of our series on the history of the Byzantine Catholic Church. So the last two were going over the history of the larger church, and we ended at the 21st century, going from St. Cyril and Methodius to today. This tonight, Father asked me to do a talk just on the Western states and also on the parish, because the parish is celebrating its 50th anniversary in October. We'll have our big dinner dance. So he wanted to go over how the church developed in the Western states, and then in particular our parish and where our parish came from, its origins, how it got built up. So one of the themes that you would have picked up listening or coming is that, the Roman Catholics had a very poor attitude towards Eastern Catholics. That's just a given. And this is a divine liturgy being offered in St. Peter's Basilica under Pope Pius XI in the 1920s, I think 1927. And it's important. It's not the first time an Eastern service would have been held there, but it's important for the shift that it demonstrates, which is important to the formation of the Byzantine Catholics in the western part of the United States. Because at the same time that American bishops were still stuck on demanding celibacy for Eastern Catholic clergy in the United States and Canada, and at the same time that there was pressure, especially in the diaspora, in America and Canada, and in South America too, for Eastern Catholics to be more and more Latin and to just be a different mass. In Rome and in Catholic academia and Catholic theological academies, and you have the beginning of real interritual ecumenism of the Eastern churches being seen as something more than a different mass. And you had union congresses in Velehrad in Czechoslovakia. You had the bishops in Poland coming around to the idea of a native, strong Greek Catholic Church. Very slow progress, but progress. And in Rome itself, the Russicum College was opened during World War I, and the popes became real patrons of the Eastern Catholics more and more and more. And the attitude of the Latin Church as the mother and teacher of all Catholics, and other Catholics being unequal and subordinate, starts to disappear. And that's really, really important, because the people who trained in Rome and studied in Rome will go back to their home countries with a much different attitude than had existed before World War I. So that's an important development. It starts under Benedict XV, really moves under Pius XI, who was a big mission pope, and Pius XII, so that you have a foundation laid for the things that happened at Vatican II, where, one of the earliest documents in Vatican II was Orientalium Ecclesiarum, which specifies the equality of all of the different Eastern Catholic communities with the Latin Church, and the role of the Pope, not just as the Bishop of Rome, but as the father of churches. So it's a huge shift. It takes a long time. But even during World War II, it continued. So this movement of appreciation, greater and greater appreciation for Eastern churches, naming of people like St. Ephrem as a doctor of the church, celebration of different liturgies in the major Roman churches, parishes being founded in a much bigger scale in the diaspora in Western Europe. So there's a lot that happens, that's very good. All right. The Outpost, the pilgrimage in Uniontown, was the big event for Byzantine Catholics in the United States. It is held Every year on Labor Day weekend, this is one of the commemoration pins that they would give out. It shows Mother Macrina Malinchuk, who was the foundress of the Sisters of St. Basil Province, who came from Europe in 1921, and the Lourdes Grotto that was built at Uniontown, at the Mother House. And the big services were held, at or near the Lourdes Grotto. Now, this started because of the big schism that took place in the 30s over the celibacy decree, as it's known, the Condata Fuera, which was not just about celibacy, but also was trying to build up the role of the bishop in the Greek Catholic Church of the United States and move the church forward. Had a lot of expectations, but the people and clergy really focused on the celibacy issue as the nail in the coffin for union with Rome, in the opinion of a lot of people. And because it developed this very strong attitude of either we will be very Catholic, thus a Lourdes Grotto at the Mother House of the Basilian Nuns, or we're going to start to be more and more Orthodox, and thus the formation of the Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Church and the gradual splintering of almost every parish in the United States. So Pope Pius XI sent the icon of our Mother of Perpetual Help to the sisters at Uniontown with the command to make her known and to use her as a way to bring about reconciliation with the Carpatho-Russian Orthodox and with all the others who had gone Orthodox. That didn't really happen, but it did become a binding event. It was a huge event. And at its peak, you could get almost 100,000 people, which was an enormous number of people coming to the pilgrimage. Every year, the sisters would record where people came from, because there were convoys of buses, chartered buses that would come, and there were groups of people, they would charter buses, they would sing hymns on the buses, they would visit, choirs would come, every parish would send banners like the ones we have in our church. So there'd be people from all over the parishes of the Exarchate. In 1941, for the first time, pilgrims appear from California. People who had moved to California and make a cross-country trip, which was not an easy thing to do in 1941, either by train or car, and came to Uniontown. And these people begin to ask for priests. And that's how it starts out here. So that's the very first time that we know that people were settled and comfortable in the Western states, that they could afford to make the trip. The end of 1941, of course, World War II comes to America with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After that, gas was rationed, tires were rationed, and so forth. And so with the war, it was much more difficult for people to get to Uniontown, although they still did get large numbers, but not from California. That was, it was too difficult. But after the war, the numbers go right up. All right, servicemen have come back and from the war, and couples come, people meet, lots of marriages took place as a result of meeting at Uniontown. And the bishop at the time brought Fulton Sheen, the great American televangelist. He's the first evangelist of the Catholic faith on American TV. His show was #1 in the United States for years and years. And Fulton Sheen not only came to Uniontown, he was a celebrant of the liturgy, and he celebrated in English in 1955. It was a big event. It was one of the biggest pilgrimages in the history of Uniontown, but he puts us on the map because he would go around the United States, including cities where we did not have organized parishes, in order to offer the liturgy with a commentary for Roman Catholics to understand what was happening. And he celebrated in English at a time when there was no English whatsoever in Latin Rite churches outside of sermons and popular devotions. You remember the Mass was entirely in Latin. And here comes Fulton Sheen, fully vested, properly vested, celebrating the liturgy very well. He knew what he was doing. And he does really and truly put us on the map. And he boosts Byzantine Catholic pride. The people who have been taught that their church was nothing more than an ethnic church or a church with a different mass have the leading Catholic prelate in the country celebrating the liturgy and explaining it and unpacking the power of it. So, migration to the west. There's a huge increase of people moving west. First, during the Great Depression, people had fled from collapsing areas like the Dust Bowl to go, to the promised land of Southern California. But the West Coast really expanded during World War II. Kaiser Steel opened a big plant in the city of Fontana, California in 1942. They were getting ready to do that in 41, but the war accelerated all of this. And the attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor and the loss of our territories and colonies in the Pacific brought home the importance of the West Coast in terms of strategy, but also in terms of the future. And the climate, especially in Southern California, was so good for aerospace testing and industry. And of course, all the ships that went out west, across the Pacific rather, from the ports like San Diego, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And so you have this big movement of people because of the shipyards, because of the new bases, because of the steel mills, and the creation and expansion of aerospace industry. And they recruited heavily in East Coast schools. So this is how you get something like what we have. Our big employer in Albuquerque is Sandia Labs, which is a Defense Department enterprise. So, in 1947, residential window air conditioning units are first introduced. And this makes it possible for people to live in hotter climates. People from back east who would go to Phoenix or Tucson and say, oh, dear God, I'm not staying here, and go home. Now it's more livable, all right? And then you get expansion of air conditioning. And you have the recruitment of workers from the Northeast and from the Midwest. Right, of new university graduates, young men who had gone on the GI Bill, right, come out with new degrees in all of these fields and move west, and the recruitment of workers. I Love Lucy. What did they do? They drove across the country to California. The Four Characters. My Three Sons, one of the most popular TV shows, no longer set in mythical towns or in New York City. Now these shows are set in Los Angeles. Right? Fred McMurray, the dad, was an aerospace engineer. It opened everything up for people doing outdoor filming and all of these things that people on the East Coast could look and see. Right? And it was a whole new way to live. 1957, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants both left New York City and went to Los Angeles and San Francisco. It was an enormous shock culturally on the East Coast and a sudden realization that the country had shifted west. Now, at this time, there were clusters of Byzantine Catholics organizing as they moved out. There were two priestly families. The elderly priests had retired to San Luis Obispo. They opened chapels in their homes to serve their families and relatives and then neighbors and friends, and they started there. Then there were communities forming in Los Angeles and San Diego. In 1956, Bishop Elko finally responded to letters coming from California, and he sent out a young priest by the name of Father Eugene Cremoga. Now, he didn't like Father Cremoga. He was sending him across the entire country with 2 names and 2 phone numbers. And when he got to Union Station, he got off the train, put in his nickel, dialed the first number, and it was disconnected. And then he prayed frantically that somebody would be home at the other one and called that number, and they came down to Union Station and picked him up. So he became the first modern missionary priest. Because by now, parishes back east that had recovered from the schism in the 30s were building up again. They were, things were good. Most parishes had a resident priest, or if they had a filial mission church, it wasn't that far away. Things were pretty stable. He had to come out and start from nothing. Right? And with these families, the Rojals, Grajales, Nurfak, and Sovich, those were the 4 families that really got started. And that's the foundation of our first parish. Big change from what had happened 30 years before. 30 years before, Greek Catholic priests would come into a diocese and present their papers to a Latin bishop. Some of them didn't even recognize them as Catholic, as being legitimate priests. Cremoga was warmly welcomed by the bishop in Los Angeles. And the bishops in California were very, very gracious and really backed him. So they gave over this old church, Nuestra Señora de Zapopan, an old Mexican mission church in Los Angeles. This is where the divine liturgies were first held, until they bought the property on Sepulveda Boulevard and set up a chapel on the property. And then Bishop Elko came out, established it canonically as a parish, and they built a Spanish-style church. All right? This is it. St. Mary of the Holy Protection. Remember, I had said before, Mary of the Holy Protection was one of the most popular titles of our parishes in the United States. And that's the patroness of the oldest eparchy of our church. Right, in Mukachevo is Our Lady of the Holy Protection. So they built a Spanish Moorish style church, and with a hall and rectory and an additional house, that are all on this big property on Sepulveda Boulevard. The 405 freeway goes right behind it. So it turned out to be a very fortuitous location, because Los Angeles is dependent on freeways. And so people could get to the church from all over the metropolitan area and get right off the exit, come down the ramp, make a right, and in 2 blocks, there you are. So much so that when we were thinking of moving, I went to the bishop at the time, and he looked at a map, and he said, "Oh, but you're right near the intersection of I-25 and I-40. And it's not very far, according to this map." And I said, "Well, no, it's not. It was, one exit." And he says, "You can't move. You got to stay." He says, "That's how people get around in the western states." And he was right. Okay, this is the type of thing that they had to create out here. So this is an article about Father Cremoga. He invited reporters to come to St. Mary's and take pictures and do interviews and explain the Byzantine rite, and that we were legitimately Catholic and this is a real church and you can come here. Now notice how the church is built. All right, Bishop Elko did not like iconostasis. He did not like very Byzantine things. So they could not put in icons. The icons are on the walls of our Lord and Our Lady. Baldacchino over the altar, and it's an open space with these Moorish arches. That's the closest he could come to putting in an iconostas. Now the church has an iconostas, but it did not for a long time. So, and there's Father Cremoga behind the tetrapod. And he was very energetic about doing things and getting around and publicizing and getting us, into church bulletins and so forth. And really his pattern, that set the model for our church still out here, because he did not present it as a Rusin, Slovak, Hungarian church. He presented it as an American Eastern Catholic Church. This is the Carmelite Monastery in San Diego. So now he comes out here. He came out here, right? 56, 57. They used that chapel. 58. They moved to Sepulveda Boulevard. This is built and dedicated in 61. Rapid growth, really fast. All right, this then is San Diego. He got another priest to come out from Pennsylvania, Father Bill Levkulik, who became very instrumental in reviving liturgical life in the United States. Really important. He became the publisher of most of the liturgical books, translated things into English, did really very important work for making devotions known and services known and bringing things back that had disappeared, like Vespers and pre-sanctified and akathists and so forth. So when Father Levkulik got to San Diego, there were 18 families. Within 3 months, they had 54 families. Right? And they had a parish within 2 years of opening the mission. Again, rapid growth. Fontana, why I brought up Kaiser Steel. Right? They recruited steel workers from Pennsylvania and brought people out to this huge plant in Fontana. It was a long drive from Fontana to Los Angeles, for Sunday liturgy. So they got their own church set up within 5 years. They had a mission that became a parish with a new church, blessed, and hall and rectory, all in 5 years. It's really, they did a lot of hard work, these people. They did a lot of really hard work. 1958, Alaska. Now, the Vatican asked Bishop Elko to open a church in Anchorage. There were no Eastern churches in Anchorage, although the Russian Orthodox Church is very old in Alaska. It goes back to the early 1700s. They wanted Elko to open a church in Anchorage. There were a few Byzantine Catholics there, but they really wanted to send Jesuits up there to serve as missionaries who would convert the Orthodox to Byzantine Catholic. That didn't really happen, but the parish established itself as a community that served both Byzantine Catholics and Orthodox. And the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox cathedrals in Anchorage are descended from our church. They were parishioners of our church that did it. Now, they had a mission in Juneau. That didn't last. But Anchorage opened its own chapel within a year. By 1964, there were only 6 Catholic families in the parish, and the Orthodox were starting to finally set up their own missions for people. And then this happened, the Good Friday earthquake. It was big, big news when it happened, because it was a massive quake and just devastated Anchorage. And they're at an angle because the whole city is at an angle. It really collapsed. And it was a disaster for the biggest city in Alaska. And Elko sent a young priest out there with the expectation he would close up the chapel and come back to Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Father Artem was never told that. So he figured his job was to build up the parish. And he was a licensed pharmacist. He got a job in a drugstore, and for the next 20 years, he worked as a pharmacist because they couldn't afford to pay him, and he built the parish up really from nothing after the earthquake to this. That's the original church over there, which was a mess hall that he got from the base and moved onto the property. And then they built this church. So he was so missionary-minded that he not only was a pharmacist working and saving the parish money in order to build up their physical property and bring in more people, and he would go out to the base and look for Byzantine Catholics or people who were interested in Byzantine Catholicism and go in the newspaper. He flew, which in Alaska you have to do. He flew all the way north to Point Barrow, and he flew all the way out to the end of the Aleutian Islands. Anywhere that he could find a Byzantine Catholic, any kind of Eastern Catholic following the Byzantine rite, he would go. And he did that for 20 years until he had a heart attack. He was a remarkable man, really, really a cool guy. He's very impressive, very dedicated. And when he finally had to step down, the bishop said, where do you have any thought where you'd like to go? And he said, 20 years in Alaska, Bishop? I'm thinking Honolulu. All right. Phoenix, how we got a church in Phoenix. People organized in Phoenix. How did they organize, by the way? People looked through the phone book. Younger people have no idea what a phone book is. So phone books were these big books that the phone company printed. And in this little tiny print were people's last names and then first name and their street address and their phone number. And so what people would do is they would go through the phone books and they would look for East European sounding names, call up and say, my name is so-and-so, I'm calling on behalf of the Byzantine Catholic Mission of so-and-so, and I'm just interested, are you Byzantine Catholic? Well, then if they weren't Byzantine Catholic, well, are you Polish, are you Slovak? Oh yeah, well, we're going to have a fundraiser making pierogi and halupki and kobasi. Oh, I haven't had that since I left Ohio. Oh, well, why don't you come? And that's how they built up the parishes. So that's what they did in all these parishes. So for 10 years, they sent letters to Pittsburgh. Remember when I told you about Bishop Elko the last time? He thought when they wanted to open a church in Washington, D.C., that was too far away from Pennsylvania. He was not exactly missionary-minded, that man. Hence, letters for 10 years. But they opened the mission in 1966. The priests flew from California after offering their morning liturgies. They took turns flying from L.A., and San Diego and coming to Phoenix. And then in 1966, they started the mission at one of the Catholic high schools. 2 years later, an Antiochian Orthodox church came up for sale. The community had gone through a split, and now they decided to reconcile, and they went to the original church. This church was vacant, had an iconostas and everything, had a little hall underneath in the basement. And so they bought this church and named it St. Stephen's in honor of Bishop Kosciuszko. The last married priest in America, Father John Bovankovich, and his wife, Pani Cecilia, they took over in 1969. So they're important for a couple other reasons. So when a priest came to Phoenix, the church at the time was on the other side of an arroyo. You had to drive down into the arroyo and up again. There was no bridge. And it was a Mennonite area of small farms, of not Amish, not strict Mennonite, but mostly Mennonites. And he went to the city hall and he said, I think we should really think about moving into town. And a guy in the city hall said, you know what, Father, stay where you are, because I guarantee you in 10 years you're going to be in the middle of the city, which is what happened. All right, so the eparchy of Parma was founded, and they set up a Western deanery to cover the western states. So the cathedral in Parma was St. John the Baptist. That's why the icon of St. John the Baptist is there. And Bishop Emil Mahalik was the first bishop. So this is St. Stephen's Church in Phoenix. I was stationed there for 3 years, and I started then St. Thomas Church in Gilbert, Arizona, while I was there. And this is the same year, all right? They set this up in 1968, taking over that church building. Then in 1969, the Annunciation Mission was opened at St. Catherine's Academy, meeting there on Sundays, and the priest was Father George Kuzma, who set about to save money to build a new church. And they continued to grow out here. So we had in this Western Deanery, St. Macrina's Church in San Mateo, California, outside of San Francisco, St. Philip's Church in Sacramento. The bishop found out that they still had $20,000 left over from the early years of the Cold War. There had been a fund for refugees from Czechoslovakia. And he gave that over to us and said, here, use this to found a parish. And then in 1974, 3 churches were established. Holy Protection of the Mother of God in Denver. The original church had been lost in the 1920s. It had become Orthodox, but a small group of people had remained faithful. And they used to meet on Saturday nights and sing Vespers together and then have dinner. And they did that for all those years. For 50 years, they kept that going. Albuquerque had been a mission, and then is canonically established as a parish. And then St. Gabriel is set up as a mission in Las Vegas. The Greek Catholic Union had its convention in Las Vegas that year, and they had liturgies as part of the convention, and there were all these local people who showed up. And they contacted Bishop Mahalik and said, you're going to have to do something. There's all these people out here. So they opened a mission there. All right. Now, Albuquerque. So this is how we get started. There was a community of Croatian Greek Catholics from the Zumbaračka region in Croatia who had been recruited as miners. And they were living mostly in Gallup. Do you remember Anne Molina? Yes. She's from that group. And they wanted a priest. And then there were the engineers that had been recruited at Sandia. They wanted a priest. Now in the 1960s, there used to be liturgies by a retired priest who had biritual faculties at this little church in the North Valley, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It didn't take off. But then there was an attempt in 1970 to form a multi-ethnic parish of the Melkites from Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, and the Slavs, both Ukrainian and Ruthenian. And they had liturgies with these 2 priests, Father Ted Isaias and then John Rebold, for 2 years. They had a choir that was formed under a gentleman from the New Mexico Symphony. They used Queen of Heaven Church over here on Phoenix Northeast. They had Sunday evening liturgies there. And Father Bovankovich and his wife would drive in from Phoenix and offer the liturgy. Also, Father Rodella would fly in from San Diego. and a couple other, and later Father Nanko. So these people were, coming together, but they could not harmonize the two communities. And so the Ruthenians and Ukrainians wanted a Slavic parish, Slavic tradition, Slavic music, and even though most of the people in the parish were mixed rite, but also mixed faith, interfaith marriages. So the community split. Now, Father Rebold was assigned to stay with the Melkites, but he got involved with the Vietnamese refugees that were coming and being settled. And so he got involved with founding Our Lady of Lavang. And so the Melkite mission folded. And there was another priest who came. Also, they tried, and it never did take off. And I even had the Melkite Patriarch come here in the early 80s and talk to the people that they could come to our parish. But there were such hard feelings, unfortunately, that it didn't reconcile. Anyway, they had invited Mahalik to send a priest to explore forming a permanent Byzantine Ruthenian parish using Slavonic and English. And in 1974, Bishop Mahalik came out here with Father Radella from California and Father Barcelo and Father Hamola at Assumption Church. And they had a big liturgy over at Assumption Church on Lomas. And the priest there was very nice to us, that they could do fundraisers at Assumption, use the hall and everything at no charge. And St. Pius X High School used to be on Louisiana, where Uptown is now. And so they had the liturgies there on Sunday mornings. And it was a big community. It was a lot of people. There was well over 100 people that were coming to it. And Father Riddell and Father Bovankovich would come. Deacon Rue White was named as the local leader of the mission. He was ordained that year. And then rapid growth. Right? In June, they bought this vacant church and rectory in Trumbull Village neighborhood with 23 committed families that were of Ruthenian Ukrainian origin. And again, most of them were mixed ethnically and ritually or religiously. In July, Bishop Dudek and Bishop Mahalik came out for the installation of Archbishop Sanchez, and they stayed and offered a hierarchical liturgy and gave the name Our Lady of Perpetual Help. Now, the people who came here wanted the name Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and Bishop Mahalik told them, no, there's too many churches with that name. You need a new name. And they kept on petitioning for Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and so he gave in. And that's how we got our name. Then they had the church set up. September 29th was the first liturgy in the new church. And then in November, Father John Kovac was assigned as the first resident pastor. And then the mission was canonically established as Our Lady of Perpetual Help. 78 was Father John Dorich. By 1982, that neighborhood was changing rapidly. Crime was escalating. People didn't want to come to church at night. And they bought this property in 1982 and moved in and had their first liturgy on Easter Sunday. And there was no rectory. There was what are the offices now? That was a tiny apartment in the back. All right, so the rest of our parish, 84, Father Lucas, then Father Hutsko. Father Hutsko was asked to go to Alaska. Father Artem had his heart attack. And so the bishop said, Joe, you like to fish, don't you? Never say yes to a bishop. So he said yes. And so then the bishop called me up and said, you're ready. You think you can do your own parish now that you got St. Thomas going and I got somebody out there? And I said, foolishly. No, not foolishly. I said, yes, Bishop. And he said, good, because I have a church for you. In 88, we purchased the rectory. 93, we started, there was a deacon who used to come and help me, Deacon John Russo, but then by 93, we had 4 Roman deacons assisting. In 94, this is how this started. We did air conditioning. The church was very crowded. We had about 100 people every Sunday, at least 90 people every Sunday. The church was small, it was hot, it was crowded, swamp cooling was worthless, and I wanted air conditioning. And so they got together and they put in the air conditioning for that for the little hall in the church and what was now the offices. And afterwards, some guys got together and said, you know what, Bob Hassica. And he said, you know what, I work for Stanbury Construction, Bradbury and Stam, rather, and I think we could do this on our own. We could expand the church. And so we did. And Easter Sunday, people came into the parking lot, and we had put up the domes on the tower, did those on Holy Saturday. In the fall, we broke ground for expansion, and we couldn't build the hall as big as we wanted because of stuff from the city and not enough money. And then we bought the Blanchette house where I now live in '98, and the expansion was blessed. And for those of you who are newer, people were here every Saturday for 2.5 years building this. It was 2.5 years of work, and we never had the only contractor we ever had did a poor job with the concrete floor. He did a lousy job. Everything else was perfect, and the inspector came, and he asked me once, he said, who the heck is the contractor? And I said, we don't have one. And he said, really? And I said, no, really. I said, why? And he said, I have never had a project this perfect in my entire career, where the lines are so plumb and everything is done so neat and everything is so clean. I've never had a job like this. So it said a lot for the work people put into this. All right. While we were growing, the territory in the West continued to grow. A mission was opened in Tucson, and then this church was founded in Spokane with a mission in Seattle. All right. Now, 81, Bishop Mahalik, who was in Parma, here in Cleveland, wrote to Rome, and he said, I cannot take care of these people out here. It is too far away. You know, a deanery is not enough. They have to be their own diocese. And so the Diocese of Van Nuys was canonically established using St. Mary of the Holy Protection as the cathedral. So that's in Los Angeles. And so it was founded at the end of 81, and then the metropolitan province was carved up like this. So this is Pittsburgh still today. This is Parma. This is Passaic, and then this is us. So in the blue. So that's our territory. So whenever Roman priests ask, well, just how big is your diocese? You just say very honestly, well, we go from Albuquerque to Anchorage. You say, that's a big territory, which it is. It's huge. Geographically, it's gigantic. All right. So this was Archbishop Kosciuszko, Bishop Dudik, who ordained me, Bishop Mahalik, and then Bishop Thomas Dolanai, who was the first bishop for what was the Diocese of Van Nuys. I had that in twice. There we go. So we have been trendsetters from the beginning, which is really important, right, for where we fit into the church today. So things that are considered very common and ordinary now, 40 years later, were extraordinary, and they were really ahead of their time, these guys. So mandatory publication of financial reports by the eparchy and in parishes, clergy weeks to bring everybody together and really work on fraternity because we're so scattered and so isolated. Workshops on evangelization, administration, communications. We had our own newspaper that I was the editor for, where the eparchy was very reliant on bi-ritual clergy, right, to help with parishes, but also sometimes even to staff parishes, because we did not have enough priests. We had no fear bringing in Roman clergy, priests and deacons. And that was important because still today, Deacon Thomas can correct me if I'm wrong, but I doubt it, most of our priests do not know their neighbors. They don't know the neighboring Roman clergy, which is bad, because it just increases your isolation. That's just not good. So, that level of interaction and interaction with other Eastern Catholics, setting aside, the battles of the homeland and forgetting that stuff and working together. So like the Southern California Eastern Catholic Clergy Association, Northern California, Arizona Eastern Catholic Clergy Association. As more and more Eastern Catholic churches have opened from various traditions, to be able to interact with one another is very good and very important. They told Rome that we had 17,000 people out here, but 17,000 was what the estimate was of Byzantine Catholics in the entire territory. We have never had more than 3,000 registered in the parishes. So it's an extraordinary amount of money that people give. So for example, in our parish, last Sunday, we had 101 people on Sunday and 30 people on Saturday. So from 131 people, we had a collection of $4,500. That came out to $35 a person, including children. $35 per capita. There is no Roman Catholic Church in the country that has that kind of a statistic and generosity. So people are very committed to having these churches, and that's very important, that people will make sacrifices. All right. And the sisters opened a convent. They had high hopes that this would become a vice province out here, that they, get away from attitudes on the East Coast and develop, but unfortunately it didn't. All right, so how the eparchy grew. So in 81, the mission in Seattle was a church. 82, I opened St. Thomas the Apostle Mission in Gilbert. St. Melanie's in Tucson moved on to its own property. 86, St. Anne was founded in San Luis Obispo. 88, St. Irene in Portland. 89, St. George's in Olympia. 1990, Bishop George Kuzma, the pastor in Annunciation, became the second bishop of the eparchy. 1993, Our Lady of Wisdom was opened. That's really important because a lot of Italo-Greeks came to the United States from Sicily and southern Italy. The priest, unfortunately, in New York City, he died during World War II. They could not get a replacement for him. By the time they could get a replacement, people were already leaving Manhattan and Brooklyn and scattering around New Jersey and Connecticut, and they never reconstituted the parish. But a large number of people went west and settled in Las Vegas, of all places. And a priest who grew up in Manhattan, and as a little boy went to that church, had to come out west because of bad lungs, and he eventually settled in Las Vegas, and one thing led to another, and they were put under our authority, not the local Latin bishop, which was really good, because Latin bishops generally have no idea what to do with Eastern Catholics who are put under their authority. They don't know what to do with them. So that parish has grown significantly. So this is the new St. Melanie's in Tucson, after they moved on to their new property. This is the North Ridge earthquake. Why I have God's sledgehammer. This is the parking garage at the college in North Ridge. The bishop's house was across the street. The earthquake struck, fortunately, early in the morning. The garage was empty. People were not out on the road yet, because it would have been a high casualty rate. When the earthquake struck, Bishop George, comes out of his house, and wreckage from the garage had landed in his driveway. And he looked up to heaven and he said, I have been praying and thinking, should I move the headquarters of the eparchy out of Los Angeles? All I needed was a nudge, not a sledgehammer. So they had to move, and they needed to decide which way do we go. And because of the size of the eparchy, so it's got to go to a city that has good airline connections, all right, to get back and forth, and for priests to come and so forth. And so it was going to be Las Vegas or Phoenix. Phoenix had the bigger plant physically, and so that's how they ended up in Phoenix. So that's how we got there. So they took over the credit union, which was getting ready to move to a new building anyway. My old apartment, they took over that. The sisters went to Phoenix, opened their convent. The parish church became a cathedral. Shortly thereafter, Bishop Skurla was enthroned as the third bishop. Bishop Gerald Dina was enthroned a couple years later as the fourth bishop. In 2010, the eparchy was renamed, all right, because you can't have the Diocese of Van Nuys and have the cathedral and everything in Phoenix. I did have a certain archbishop here say that to me. He says, I think you people need to get that straightened out. And I said, oh, you mean like the fact that Archdiocese of Santa Fe has its offices in Albuquerque, but the cathedral in Santa Fe? That's different. And I said, well, not really, but okay. So anyway, they did. So, and then it's nice because the oldest eparchy of Mukachevo is dedicated to the Holy Protection. Right? The newest eparchy of the Ruthenian Church was dedicated to the Holy Protection, and put under her patronage. So it's a very nice thing. All right, and then Bishop John Pazak was the 5th bishop and retired just a couple of years ago. All right, so here's the patroness. Pokrov was very popular in Ukraine, in West Ukraine. Not just the feast. The feast is very popular among the Slavs, all the Slavic churches, Holy Protection. It's very popular in Ukraine. There was almost every town I went to in West Ukraine, there would be a life-size statue like this of Our Lady with a veil in her hands, right? And there, and people coming to pray all the time. And I was in one particular town, and we were leaving, and it was pouring rain. It was cold and wet, and it was one of those heavy rainstorms. And there were these ladies walking with flowers, and the guy driving the car said, oh, they must be having a funeral at the church or something. Because nobody was out walking, but they were walking to the statue, to Pokrov, and they took out the old flowers and put in the new flowers. And some did the church in Spokane and Seattle and Olympia. Father Stanichar, he had retired from the Air Force as a chaplain. He founded, after he retired from being a parish priest, he opened Duchovny Dom Monastery in Oregon, which seems to be doing well, and is a good house of prayer. So hopefully they're going to do well and have good vocations coming there. This is our cathedral in Phoenix. The priest who followed the Bovenkoviches was of the Elko school. And he tore down the iconostas in St. Stephen's and put in an organ. Yes. So they eventually they put in this iconostas. So this is St. Stephen's Cathedral with Our Lady of the Sign on the back wall under a stained glass window of the Holy Spirit. So this is what our cathedral looks like. And this is St. Gabriel's Church in Las Vegas. And this is the Italo-Greek Church, Our Lady of Wisdom. It's the church and hall. St. Irene's in Portland. The Diocese of Portland was closing this church building and gave it to us to take over. St. Anne's in San Luis Obispo, which was built by the people up there. St. Philip, the priest who was here this Sunday, this is his church. In fact, that's him praying on the right. So that's the parish in Sacramento. The Holy Protection Church in Denver, which has a mission in Fort Collins. And St. John Chrysostom in Seattle, which has a mission in Skagit Valley. St. George's Church in Olympia, which has the big shrine to Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And the northern parishes have an annual pilgrimage in August. And this is the big plant Annunciation. I mentioned that Father Kuzma started saving money. They had $500,000 saved when they bought this property and built this church. So it's a big property. This is Holy Angels in San Diego. So this is used by our parish, and also the Melkite Mission meets there after our liturgy is over. And a lady named Millamina, she did all of the iconography there and in Gilbert at St. Thomas. And this is where the mission meets from Anchorage at Sacred Heart Church. All right, and this is the newest mission in Hawaii. So this is Monsignor Kevin McAuliffe celebrating the liturgy. So Father Andrews goes there, and Father McAuliffe and Father Diodoro Mendoza, they take turns going to offer liturgy for these people. And this is the shrine on Mount Lemmon. which is also a mission community in the little town of Summerhaven, all wooden church built in Carpathian style. And that's our turf of the eparchy of the Holy Protection. And the big question is, so where do we go from here? So in 1999, we had 3,100 parishioners, 16 parishes. We now have 2,300 parishioners in 19 parishes and several missions. There's a movement of population out of California, as you all know. That's where most of our churches are, or that's where a significant number of our churches are. That's where we started. But young families can't afford to buy a house there. Taxes are high. Conditions there are not great. It's no longer the promised land. Lots of people leaving these parishes. So they go elsewhere. But, like I said the last time, there's a great interest in Eastern Christianity in America at this time. Numbers of people convert to Orthodoxy. There are numbers of people who come to our parishes looking for something. Right? They're looking for God in the Eastern tradition, and that's good. And our parishes out here are parishes that are basically composed of converts, reverts to the faith. So converts to the faith from every possible background, reverts to the faith, people that had given up being Catholic and then were encouraged to try our church by parishioners, right? And young families, as you see in our parish, lots of children. So, a future. There's a future. And now we have new immigrants. We have immigrants coming from South America who like our churches. They like the traditions. They like the music. They like the small community. And we have immigrants coming now again from Eastern Europe showing up in our parishes. So, the cycle goes on. And our growth in Jesus Christ is really going to be rooted in these things. There's a great hunger for small communities. Americans are too isolated. Social media is supposed to interconnect the whole planet, and instead, people have become so isolated. I remember taking my dog down to Alvarado Park once, and I saw a family walking around the perimeter of the park with their dog. And I thought, isn't that nice? Whole family out, the cool of the evening. It was wonderful. And then as they're walking, I realized every single person in the family had a phone. And they were all reading the phone. The only member of the family not reading the phone was the dog. And I was waiting for them to all walk into the same tree. They were not looking at each other or talking to each other. Right? And that's a real problem. And COVID made it worse. So people are starving for community. I see this at UNM with Cafe. Challenging faith. They don't want an easy faith. The churches that have offered an easy faith, like the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, United Methodists, are all dying. They're disappearing. They are losing members. The average Episcopalian parish has 59 people on a Sunday in the United States. Methodists are just going through a huge schism. People wanted challenging faith. They wanted a faith that challenges them. Serving others is important. Again, we're so isolated. As Americans, we become so fragmented. Growing knowledge of faith. To have 18 people aged 18 to 21 show up twice a month to learn about the faith is remarkable. But that's what we have at the university. And examples from our parish of what really everybody has to do. Social media, you got to be out there. Got to be out there. The days of getting articles in the newspaper are gone. You have to be on YouTube. You have to be on Instagram. Cafe at UNM is a great example of going to a hostile environment and taking a shot at it and succeeding. Ask a Priest, the high school group. Most of the kids do not go to this church, but they now all know about this church. They come here once a month. They ask questions. They're going to remember, and their families are going to remember that we welcomed them. Choir, prayer warriors. We've produced 6 priests. As of the end of June, we will have produced 6 priests from this parish. a church that has never had more than 100 families in it, and 2 nuns, with possibility of a third. It's remarkable what a small church can do with a small population. And I think that, we have a lot to offer to the churches back east, to be able to say to churches back east, this is what can happen in a church of only a few hundred, not even a few hundred people. A church with 130 people can do that, right, in the span of its 50 years. Churches that are 100 years old, can do even better. So, all right, it's an hour at 7 o'clock. I'll take a couple questions and then we'll go eat. So, anybody got a question? There will be a test afterwards.
How many families then did you have when you originally established or started?
23. 50 years ago, there were 23 households.
How many people were here when you arrived?
40. People.
Yes.
I think we had a dozen households, maybe 15. So we really had to kind of start all over again. And there was a terrible debt. It was a $110,000 mortgage with $970 a month payment with 40 people. And they could barely pay me. I mean, I don't know how we made it. And when I went to the bank, there was about $200 in the checking account. So, and the furnace broke, and the gas line broke. And the guy who came to look at it, he said, I can't fix this. This belongs in a museum. This is from World War II, which it really was. So, and my point in saying that is not, I'm not tooting my horn. I'm rather tooting the horn of the people, because they worked very, very, very hard. And they were very, very generous. And they wanted this church to survive and do more than survive. Agnes Adamsko always said every Sunday, she says, I want this church to be here for the next generations, which it has. And look at all the people we get now from all over the place. And it's really remarkable. So, okay?